The book of Hebrews. What a wonderful book, and a mysterious book, and a deep book. If you want to go deep, this is deep. Jesus is better. That's a general theme. It's going to talk about the superiority of Christ and why Jesus is better. You'll see why in just a moment. That is the theme. Now, the literary form of Hebrews is that it opens without any personal greeting, which raises the question whether this is a letter, because normally letters would have a personal greeting. But maybe it's a sermon or a collection of sermons or perhaps an essay. So scholars have debated this, and many of them believe that this is a sermon that would be spoken and heard. And I tell you, you'd have to really be paying attention to get it, but they did. The writer here is brilliant in the way that he constructs the book and the way that he brings the message across. Now, the destination is debated to some degree. The oldest manuscript that we have says to the Hebrews. And so it would seem to be that it's to the Hebrews, but that might be a little bit misleading, thinking that it's written to Jewish people. But it is actually to Christians. So they are Jewish Christian people. They are Hebrew Christians, or Christians who are Hebrews. We also find it's to a specific group of Christians, where he expects to visit them, as stated in 13:23. So it's not just a general letter. It does appear to have a particular audience, even though uncharacteristically it doesn't mention who they are at the very beginning. And it seems to be a specific group of Jewish Christians. So you can see we're narrowing this down as to who this particular book is written to. It's very important in the concept of hermeneutics to understand as best we can who wrote it and to whom did they write it and what were the circumstances, so that we can find out what the answer was given to them, and then we can see how that applies to ourselves. Now, the locality of the first recipients, the first people it's written to, is debated by scholars. Some believe that these Hebrew Christians were in Jerusalem, which of course would make some sense because that's where Christianity began and that's where a lot of Jewish people live. Others say, well, it's Alexandria of Egypt. Alexandria, named after Alexander the Great. It's a phenomenal cultural place. It had the best and largest library of the time. In fact, the Hebrew Old Testament or scriptures were translated into Greek and put into the library there. And so there was a big contingency of Jewish people in Alexandria. And then others say it was written to Hebrew Christians who were in Rome, who had come back to Rome after they had been displaced in 49 AD by Hadrian. Now here seems to be the situation. Nero had a persecution and it had just begun. Judaism is still considered a legal religion. You may remember that the Roman Empire had many religions. They believed in many gods, and they did recognize Judaism, but Christianity had not been around long enough to become an official religion. So Judaism is legal, Christianity is not at this point. Jewish believers are now lapsing back into Judaism. And this letter is written to prevent this lapse by showing the superiority of Christ. Therefore, the theme that we mentioned at the very beginning, Jesus is better. Jesus is better than the old Jewish ways. So these people had become Christians. Now they're going back to Judaism. They're going back to their old way of life. And the writer of Hebrews is saying, don't do that. Jesus and the church are better, 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 better. And we'll see by the end of our presentation what he's better than. I'd like to suggest something, too, for us as an application, that there are many people who kind of like Jesus but may not like the church, and they will revert back to their old lifestyle. And I think that the book of Hebrews can help us by saying, no, don't go back to your old life. Jesus and the church are better, better, better than anything that you've had before. Now, the authorship of Hebrews is greatly debated. Some people say it was Paul. In fact, if Paul wrote the book of Hebrews, then he absolutely wrote most of the New Testament, not only in the number of books, but in volume. Just as a little side light, if he didn't write Hebrews, then Luke actually wrote more of the New Testament as far as volume is concerned. Clement of Alexandria said that Paul was the author. But in the late 2nd century, a man by the name of Tertullian suggested perhaps it was Barnabas. Barnabas, the son of encouragement, who was always helping people throughout the book of Acts. Harnack in the 19th century said it was Aquila and Priscilla, and said perhaps one of the reasons that the author does not identify himself is because it's partially by herself, that maybe this was written by a woman, and therefore, since that would not have been so accepted in that time, that person didn't identify herself, and that Aquila and Priscilla, as a team, as a husband and wife team, actually wrote this. Martin Luther thought that Apollos wrote it, and part of the reason for this is because it's such good Greek. It's among the best Greek in the New Testament, and we know that Apollos is described as being a great orator. That doesn't necessarily mean he's a great writer, but Martin Luther said, well, since he was such a silver-tongued preacher, he probably could write very well, and this is his writing. And then there are other people who have been suggested. Luke, again, because the Greek is good, and so is Luke's. Clement of Rome, Silas, Philip the Evangelist, different people have been suggested. Perhaps the best conclusion comes from Origen, who said, who wrote it? Only God knows. Here's the occasion. We mentioned that people are going back to their old style of life. And so there is a leadership issue that was in the church that was decaying, and the church was facing persecution. That may be the reason why they were going back, is they thought, why should I put up with this? I had a good thing going in Judaism. I'll just go back to that again. So this kind of issue of the decaying leadership, apparently, and the facing of possible persecution was leading some people to revert back to Judaism. So the purpose is to counteract complacency within the church, because some of the people apparently were complacent, but it was also to help prevent apostasy. Apostasy is one of those intriguing terms that really means to give up, revert, go back on one's faith. For me, the best way to understand this is to think of the Apostle Paul in reverse. The Apostle Paul, when he was Saul, persecuted the church, and then he became a believer and was a great advocate of the church and of Christ. If you think of it in regard to Paul and the reversal of it, this would be somebody who is a part of the church and advocating the church, and now they are persecuting the church. They've committed apostasy. That which they were for, they are now against. But the purpose, as we've mentioned previously, and it can't be stressed enough, is a key concept of the superiority of Christ and the church. Jesus and the church are better than going back to the old lifestyle, better than going back to their former Jewish faith. The date of Hebrews depends upon the author, somewhere between 68 and 96. 13:9 may indicate that the author is in prison, and therefore in imprisonment and persecution. And as a result of that, these dates either dealing with the time of Nero and his persecution, or all the way up to Domitian and his persecution, have been suggested. Now here is an outline of the book of Hebrews that shows that Christianity is superior to Judaism, where Jesus is better. That he is better because Christianity came not through the prophets, but through the Son of God. And so Jesus is superior to the prophets. Because Christianity came not through angels, but through the Son of God, that Jesus is better than angels, which were held in very high regard by the Jewish people. Because Christianity was given not through Moses and Joshua, but through Christ. And that, again, a new law is given through Jesus, and that he is the one taking people out of the wilderness into the promised land like Joshua. That Joshua is a forerunner for Jesus. In fact, the word Joshua means Jehovah saves in Hebrew. Jesus means Jehovah saves in Greek. In fact, when Mary would have been talking to Jesus as a child and as he was growing up, she would have called him Joshua. Joshua is his name in Hebrew. Because Christianity has a better priesthood than that of Judaism. In fact, he is a better high priest than Aaron. He has a better covenant. He has a better sanctuary. There is a better sacrifice, and there are better promises. So all of that to show that Jesus is a better high priest, and he has a better way of doing things than what the old covenant had. Not saying that those things were bad. It's just a matter that Jesus is better. He's superior, and that these were a forerunner, a prototype of his ministry and who he is. And then we have a great exhortation to steadfastness in Christ at the end of the book, to stick with it. And a beautiful passage right at the beginning of chapter 12, where Jesus, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, and that we need to endure as well. And then the conclusion at the end of the book, trying to tie all these things together. What a great book the book of Hebrews is. And there's a lot of depth. There's some difficult passages in the 6th and the 10th chapter of talking about apostasy and the fact that there's no longer sacrifice that could be given for those particular sins. I think that it's worthwhile you reading this and analyzing, chewing on it. It'll take it a while because it's a pretty long book, but it will be very significant, I think, in your understanding of not only Judaism, but why Christ is better than anything else that we can hold on to.